You're on StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale. And this morning's conversation is with Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary, and after his retirement, a prolific author on China and India, China, as well as China's foreign policy and strategic outlook over the past half a century or so. And someone who watches the China space or the India China space very closely. So, welcome to this program, Vijay, and it's good to have you again.
Thanks, Nitin.
So, it's been 4 years now that the standoff in Galwan or the incident in Galwan happened, and post that on 29th, 30th August 2020, there was the counter move by India on the Kailash range of Ladakh, which has kind of a stalemate that has occurred between the forces on the line of actual control. So 4 years later, where do you see India-China relationship in the context of what has happened in these last 4 years?
Well, I can only describe the India China relationship at the moment as in a state of suspension because there have been no serious efforts by either side to rebuild a political and diplomatic relationship which basically collapsed after the Galwan incident. I have always expressed the view that the arrangements that were put in place between 1988 and 2010 were no longer tenable. In a number of cases, it is China which upset that relationship, particularly along the line of actual control, but also in other areas, such as denial to India's case to enter the nuclear suppliers group or the listing of Indian concerned terrorists in the UN Sanctions Committee, and so on and so forth. So by 2019, the relationship was already fraying, and Galwan was the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, we haven't really rebuilt that relationship, not just politically, of course, but even economically, diplomatically, or in any other area, multilaterally. We have not actually taken steps to rebuild it. And I think that now, since it has been more than 4 years since the tragic incident of June 2020, it may perhaps be both the time and and perhaps we have the opportunity also now, since our elections are over, to start thinking about how we build a new relationship with them.
So it has to be a complete fresh start, you would think, in terms of a modus vivendi or even the protocols that have now been completely sort of shattered or been thrown out of the window by the Chinese, especially on the line of actual control. I'll come to other issues a little later, but because of what has happened on the border and what continues to be a situation where forces are in large numbers present in Ladakh and Aksai Chin, what do you think is the first step that should occur from either side so that the logjam is broken?
It has to be a fresh start, simply because the actions of the Chinese side have brought the boundary question once again to the front and center of the relationship. And as the government of India has correctly said, if this is the elephant in the room, can you keep the elephant aside and deal with the other smaller issues? So, I don't think the government of India's condition is that you must resolve the boundary issue in order to have a normal relationship. But it is the government of India's position, and quite rightly so, that to have the normal relationship, we cannot simply say that the situation on the boundary is something that both sides must accept and move on. Because clearly it is not acceptable to our side. Now, I think that the military to military contacts have continued, but as I pointed out in my paper, which I did for the Times of India, uh, the military by itself cannot initiate any change in policy. It is, after all, only one of the instruments government has. Policy is made by the government of India in New Delhi, not by the military along the line of actual control. So the resumption of the political relationship, I think, is the first thing that needs to be done. I'm not suggesting that it should be at the summit level, or even for that matter at the ministerial level in the beginning. We have in the past, when we have faced difficult circumstances, whether were in 1987 or in 1998, begun with official level contacts, but with the express purpose of trying to build a new relationship and to start or restart the political dialogue. And I think we should do so now too.
Yeah, I think you're right about the timing that now the time is ripe from both sides should take the initiative. In that context, since you've dealt with China so very closely in your foreign service career, this mechanism of WMCC, is it adequate to restart a dialogue, or you think there should be something at the level of a secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs?
You know, the WMCC, Nitin, is specifically mandated only to look after matters relating to the border peace and tranquility arrangements. Now, of course, under its rubric, you could discuss anything else, but there has to be a willingness for both sides to put those topics for normalization of ties on the agenda. Now, there are other mechanisms you have. This includes, if I am not mistaken, a protocol between the two countries which allows for foreign ministry consultations at an official level. And that level is not at the level of the secretary, but at the level of the joint secretary or the director general of both ministries. That could be one possibility. You, of course, have ambassadors now in both countries, so the initiation of dialogue could take place even at that level. But I think very quickly on, you have to move from simply contacts to substantive discussions on expectations from each other. And those substantive discussions can happen only when people in authority on both sides have a dialogue. That is either at the level of the foreign secretary or at the level of the external affairs minister or at the level of the national security advisor. My contention has always been that talking to the Chinese does not in any way mean that you compromise either on your principles or on your asks. And nor does it mean that you scale down or diminish in any way your efforts at deterrence. Talking and deterring is a normal tactic of diplomacy that is used by many countries, and I'm only advocating that in this case it should be used by us.
I think you're right, because I think you had cited, or somebody else has mentioned this, that during even at the height of the Cold War, the two sides, the Soviets and the Americans, never stopped talking. So you know that precedence is there, and certainly it's art of diplomacy which is there. But one of the other concerns in India, many quarters express that concern, is the increasing trade deficit between India and China, and that is not really conducive to what India should be doing. But what are the options there for India really, besides completely stopping, supply chains from China? Because I don't see any way out there to decrease the trade deficit. Is that a concern in the talks really?
So I do not recall any statement by the government of India about completely stopping imports from China. Nor
No.
is it wise to do so. I think the government and people in the government fully recognize that in a globalized world, dependence on external supply chains is part of the game. And in India's case in particular, some of our best performing export sectors, textiles, pharmaceuticals, electronic goods, and auto components, all have Chinese contributions, let me put it that way, which make our exports successful. I think the government's focus, and rightly so, is to deleverage. In other words, to try and reduce dependency on China, and as far as possible to reduce dependency drastically in those sectors that we consider strategic. So I think the debate that is beginning now, and you would have seen the economic survey as well as other articles in the Indian media calling for a relook at policy, is a debate not about decoupling from China, but a debate about how we can set about the process of deleveraging so that our strategic interests are not compromised, if, God forbid, there is some difficulty with China which leads to some sort of a military conflict or even some sort of an economic boycott. And I think that's a healthy debate to have, because if you look at it in any sector, and let's take the railways for example, signaling or communications technology is something that can be very easily compromised and can seriously damage India's national security. But steel girders for laying the tracks, or sleepers, or even the outer shells of, let us say, carriages for the high speed rail, not the inside electronics, but simply the outer shell. If these cannot be made in India, or there is a shortage in India, I don't see why we should not source it from China, provided it is the cheapest possible option for us. And this is putting it rather simplistically, I do agree. But this is, I think, the direction in which the debate is going. And I think it is a healthy debate. And it is also, I understand, uh, coming from our industry and from our business leaders, because a lot of them feel that the restrictive approach we have taken so far, whether it is on imports, whether it is on travel, direct travel between the two countries, whether is on documentation to allow people to move, has in a sense impacted adversely on business. Now, of course, ultimately it is government that makes policy, and government has information on all aspects of national security that very often others don't have. But I think because economic growth is such a high priority for our government, we have to take cognizance of the fact that some of it at least will be dependent on Chinese supply chains. And we have to find a way around the problem so that we stop their involvement in strategic sectors, but we allow it to take place in other sectors which are beneficial to our own economy and to our own economic well-being.
Absolutely. In fact, all other countries which have an adversarial or a tense relationship with China, for such as Australia or US or any other country, are adopting this what the pragmatic approach that you are suggesting, that they are not completely cutting off supply chains from China. They cannot for various reasons. But yes, strategic sectors must be kept out of the Chinese involvement or influence. But the and also I think what encourages the businesses now is that the government has opened a new portal for issuing visas to
Right.
crucial technicians and specialists coming from China. So probably there is some movement there. The government again maybe having a lot of internal debate too, because the ministries have different opinions. National security ministries may have an opinion, commerce may have something else, the ministers may have something else. So we don't know where it is going. But you're right about being pragmatic in treating the Chinese supply lines the way they should be, and not give them undue leverage or importance. But moving on, let's widen the context of the India-China relationship in a way. The new Chinese ambassador has been, making statements which are not fully comprehensible to me, at least, where he sometimes makes the point that we should go back to Panchil, 5 points, the agreement of the 1950s. Those principles must be applied. Then he says businesses are being impacted because Chinese businesses are not being given. So we don't know what is the direction that he has and why he's making those statements. But if the India-China relationship has to come back on the rails, you've already mentioned that the talks must begin. But does the US-China tension or US-China relationship impact on the India-China relationship in any way?
Yeah, so let me first comment on the Chinese ambassador's recent efforts on X and other social media. I would
Right.
describe them as amateurish. In one particular case, yesterday I saw a tweet where it was International Elephant Day, and he tweeted that the Chinese also revere the elephant, and therefore we hope it will in some way foster a better relationship between India and China. I think this amateurishness springs out of a very outdated view of India, which persists in the Chinese establishment. There is an unwillingness to recognize that we have moved on diplomatically, economically, and in terms of national security, and that we need to be addressed very differently rather than clinging on to the old ideas of associating India with elephants and sadhus and snakes and dancing and culture and so on. So I would really think that the Chinese ambassador's approach needs to undergo a fundamental change, frankly speaking. Now,
That's well said. Yeah.
on the other question, I think that's a very critical question. I have been of the view for at least the last 24 to 36 months that in China's perception, India is tilting towards the United States. Now, I want to be clear here. I am not suggesting that we are tilting. I am saying that China perceives this, and obviously, China makes policy on its perception, not on the reality as we know it or see it. And therefore, I think that the Sino US relationship becomes a critical factor in the determining of the China India relationship as well. And I would even go to the extent of saying that Sino US rivalry is now so deeply entrenched in the Chinese system that China's relations with practically every other significant country, Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, Russia, Vietnam, and the European countries are all determined also or are all viewed also from the Sino American prism. In other words, where do those countries stand, whether it is India, Russia, Japan, or Australia, where do we stand vis a vis the Sino US competition? Do we side with the United States? Do we prefer to side with the Chinese? Or are we, in some sense, sitting on the fence? And therefore, this I think is perhaps the heart of the matter, and we need to have serious research and serious discussion around it. Because our relationship with the United States is not just a bilateral relationship anymore, it has repercussions on our relations with Russia, with China, with our Quad partners, and perhaps even with the global South. There's an interlinkage now, which we need to acknowledge, which has not been studied enough, and which I hope your channel and others like you will actually focus on going ahead.
No, certainly. I mean, there is a need, there is a lack of scholarship, there's lack of discussion, like you clearly said. But my question remains, do the Chinese see us through the US prism to the detriment of the Sino India relationship?
Of course, they do. I think they now believe that we have tilted towards the United States, and that the so-called strategic autonomy, non-alignment, and various other principles we have espoused from time to time, including Panchsheel for that matter, is not something that we adhere to. Now, they would not, they hesitate to say so publicly, but I am quite convinced that within their system, this is now the view. Um,
So, yeah, yeah, go ahead. Huh.
no, so we have to deal
Ah.
with that, and we have to factor it into our own policy.
True. So, there's the other side of the debate in this context that okay, they see us as tilting towards the US, and it's hard to convince some of their interlocutors that this is not so. I think that debate keeps on happening. But the other point that I wanted to also have your views on is about so-called multi-alignment policy that India is right now pursuing, which is different from non-alignment. And the Chinese think that India's relationship with Russia is one example where they can actually de-link the American influence and deal with the Chinese bilaterally, but which they're not getting a clear signal from India. So this is all mixed up as far as the Chinese scholars or Chinese interlocutors on track 1.5 or track 2 are concerned. How do you see this confusion that is coming up in the discussions between Indian and Chinese interlocutors on a non-governmental in the non-governmental sector, really?
Yeah, I think the Chinese do know that we have pursued a multi-vector alignment policy. Because the fact of the matter is that after the year 2000, from the time of Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, we have had working relations, good relations, and even very good relations with all the major players, with the People's Republic of China, the United States, the Russian Federation, the European Union, and Japan. And these are essentially the major economic and political players in the international stage today. Now, this multi-vector policy has been followed by subsequent governments as well, including this government. But I feel that, therefore, the absence of a dialogue now with China, in a sense, diminishes that multi-vector policy. Because while you certainly have very stable, very forward-looking approaches and dialogues with the other players, you have at the moment no political contact with China. And that, in a sense, in a sense, you are tying one hand behind your back, because it is all said and done the second most economically developed country in the world. It has the second largest military spending in the world. It is the largest trading nation in the world, and therefore simply cannot be ignored or set aside. And that's why I feel that it's not just for India-China relations, but in the context of a larger Indian foreign policy, that some sort of a dialogue needs to be established. Now, the Chinese also understand that India has better relations with much of the world than they have. By much of the world, I mean not necessarily the global south, I'm talking of the major players. But they will never articulate this. They will tell you that you are falling for the American ploy of containing China, that the alliance system that the United States is seeking to bind you in is a 20th century Cold War concept, that the United States is following a balance of power policy which does not suit India, which is like China, a rising power in the Indo-Pacific. So these are arguments that I think their party trots out, and that the foreign ministry has to then trot out as well, because it is the party line. But if indeed this is the approach that they take in governmental meetings, and obviously I have no experience of what has recently been discussed, I can say it is not going to sound convincing either to the government of India or to the larger Indian public opinion. Because
True.
what it
I think
suggests at the end is that India has no agency of its own. We don't have a mind of our own. Our government has no independent thinking of its own. We simply blindly follow Washington and its diktat. And from our own history from 1947, I think the one thing we can confidently say of every government of India is that we do pretty much what we want. We don't seem to listen to anybody's diktat, however powerful or big they are.
In fact, this is what I, sort of I listen to, or I get to hear at very many places, that India somehow gets buffeted from both sides. So I'll just explain what I mean by that. If you go to the Quad countries and speak to some of their diplomats and scholars, those four countries, they say India does not pull its full weight in the Quad because it is got relationship with Russia. It's got its own problems with China. So therefore, we are not sure whether they are a trusted partner. That's one side of the debate. The other side, China says that you are a part of the Quad and you are tilting towards the US, like what we have discussed. So in a way, India loses on both sides. Nobody seems to trust India in that sense. And Russia being Russia, Prime Minister Modi has gone to Russia. I don't know how that signal is being read by the Chinese. So I want your opinion on the Russia visit and the Russia-China-India equation as a final question.
Well, I think the visit of the Prime Minister to Russia would have been very carefully watched in Beijing. And it would have sent the message to them that India not only values its trusted relationship with Russia, but that the Russians have the same view and the same sentiment. And therefore, it is not a question of either or for the Russians, it is a question of them both. It's another matter that the visit may not have been viewed with the same positive approach in the European capitals or in the United States. But certainly in China, the message that would have gone home would be that India's relationship with the West is not going to be determining India's relationship with other partners, including Russia. And I hope that this message also means for China that India is not going to determine its China relationship based solely on its relationship with the West. But frankly speaking, I think I'm being far too optimistic in that regard. Having dealt with the Chinese for a very long time, my own sense is that their blindness to India's recent achievements and their unwillingness to accept any other country as an equal to them in Asia, their view that they are the dominant power and that everyone else must acquiesce or defer to them because there is a hierarchy in the Indo-Pacific, makes it very difficult for them then to understand Indian foreign policy in the way that we understand it. And unfortunately, we have to live with it and we have to deal with that.
True. I think that's where there is a no-win situation in a way, or a very difficult position for India. But hopefully, what you have prescribed, especially the need for a dialogue, no matter what the difficulties are, I think is the bottom line really. And therefore, we'll see how this goes going forward. There are summits coming up, and maybe some opportunities, or even kind of a direct approach between India and China. Whether it comes through or not, we don't know, but we'll continue to be optimistic, I suppose. But thanks for these insights. It's a valuable conversation, and thank you for your time, Vijay.
Not at all. Always a pleasure, Nitin. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary, and of course a China scholar. We'll continue to bring to you these conversations. They are valuable, they are insightful, as you are aware. So do keep watching StratNews Global. We have fully back restored our YouTube channel after a bit of a struggle. But do keep watching, and of course keep sending your feedback, which is extremely important for us to calibrate our coverage. For the time being, it's goodbye.